1 in 10 mortgage holders is struggling to make their repayments, and thousands of those are living in negative equity and in arrears. It's been suggested recently that they could be offered debt forgiveness, where all or part of their mortgage would be written off. But is it fair to ask the rest of us to pay? Midweek's Ciara Doherty has this report.
This country has spent the last 2.5 years coming up with the solutions and the cash to bail out our bust banks. The plan has and will cost Irish taxpayers billions of euros. But while it's hoped that this money helps the bank repay their colossal debts, there's little to help homeowners repay their own huge personal debt. But is that all about to change?
Not for the first time, and probably not for the last time, the issue of debt forgiveness raised its head last week, with the AIB saying it was something that they would consider. In its crudest form, it involves writing off some or all of the debt of those who can't make their mortgage repayments. But is it fair? Is it unfair? Is it a moral hazard? Or is it a necessary evil?
Ideally, nobody should get debt forgiveness. In an ideal world, everyone honours their contracts specifically as to what they said, when they agreed it and how they agreed it. But there are times where that simply isn't possible. When you get to a point where you have someone that you know has no capacity to pay, even upon strict examination, then it is pointless to pursue that, even from a commercial perspective, because you're spending money trying to retrieve something that you're never going to get. In those cases, a targeted programme of debt forgiveness could be a great idea for people.
The latest figures from the central bank revealed that thousands of homeowners are struggling to pay their mortgage. Almost 45,000 mortgage accounts were in arrears, 2/3 of those by more than 6 months. They owe a total of €8.6 billion. Another 35,000 mortgages have been classified as restructured but are performing. But many other homeowners are under huge financial pressure because of pay cuts and tax increases, and are just managing to make their payments. So who would debt forgiveness help?
Let's take two neighbours, couple A and couple B. Both got 100% mortgages and paid €300,000 for their apartments at the top of the boom. They're worth just €200,000 now. Couple A, however, have lost their job and are unable to make their mortgage repayments. Their arrears are just building up. Under debt forgiveness, those arrears and the negative equity even might be written off. Couple B living upstairs haven't lost their jobs, but they're under huge financial pressure. They are, however, making those mortgage repayments. Debt forgiveness would be of no help to them whatsoever.
A government group established last year to examine mortgage arrears recommended a scheme whereby borrowers who could pay at least 66% of the interest due on their loans could have their interest deferred for 5 years. FLAC's Paul Joyce was a member of the group, but believes the recommendations should have gone further.
The situation is obviously far more serious, plus the recent stress tests have laid pretty bare the extent of the mortgage arrears problems that a number of the recapitalised institutions have. So it's interesting that the incoming government has specifically stated that the recommendations of the Cooney Group, as it's called now, are now inadequate and much more fundamental help is needed, and we would agree with that.
What would FLAC like to see implemented?
We think at this stage that we need to look at a formal assessment of whether a mortgage is sustainable or not.
Where a mortgage isn't sustainable and a person is going to have to surrender their home or be repossessed, FLAC thinks debt forgiveness is essential.
Where a property is repossessed and there's negative equity, there's a balance due and owing. The group recommended that the mortgage shortfall should become part of any debt settlement legislation, i.e. the borrower would repay to the best of their ability over a reasonably short period of time and then get a write-off. That personal insolvency stroke debt settlement legislation has still not been put in place.
Their position is supported in part by a number of high-profile economists who feel that leaving hard-pressed homeowners bearing the burden of colossal debts into the future will have disastrous social and economic consequences. The Irish mortgage broker's Carl Dieter is among that group.
If somebody can't pay and they have judgments against them that would actually stop them from ever taking a job for fear that they'll have this claim on their future income, you create poor people and you make sure that they stay poor.
It has been suggested by some that forgiveness could go further. There are many cases where homeowners could pay part of their mortgage if the negative equity or their arrears were written off. But most feel the parameters of any debt forgiveness scheme need to be kept very narrow. For those meeting their monthly repayments and not in debt, the idea of further bailouts is unpalatable.
If you take on a debt, you know, you got to pay it off. That's what life's about, tough life.
I think a lot of people will just use it as a cop-out and say, right, we're off to Australia, we're off to Canada, here's the house, goodbye, debt lease is left behind.
Well, for those of us who didn't actually buy into the, I suppose the borrow now, pay later, we end up paying twice. We're bailing out the banks and we're bailing out individuals, regardless of how traumatic individual cases are. Those of us who are in that situation will be hit twice.
While this viewpoint is understood, it seems accepted that some level of debt forgiveness is inevitable.
You'll have some of us here who are saying, well, we've been meeting our mortgage repayments for years. Maybe our loans are paid off and we had our hard times. Why should we pick up the tab? Because the taxpayer has been forced to pick up the tab in every case, and why give it to them? So we don't want that to happen. So equity and fairness is going to have to be looked at here, and I think most of the answers coming back as to why would you do that is that, well, we're in a stalemate at the moment. There will have to be debt write-off in certain cases.
There is another concern.
For the bank, and therefore for the state and the taxpayer, there is a risk that when borrowers who are making their repayments hear stories of distressed homeowners getting their debts paid off, there will be a perverse incentive for them to stop making their repayments. But is this preventable?
The financial regulator Matthew Elderfield expressed concern about this and the fact that the cost would have to be borne by taxpayers or other borrowers.
The challenge is to identify the people who need it, but stop everybody from piling in, because if you have a scheme where someone says you might be able to get your debt written down, it's going to be attractive to a lot of people. Like, let's be honest about it. This is a country where I think if we had something like that, the ethical divide of is it wrong or right to jump in on it might become a little blurred. So the scheme has to involve a lot of pain for the participants, but doing so in an acknowledgement that in some way they might have a future.
There are further complications, like setting the criteria for debt forgiveness, examining whether the bank could offer forgiveness in exchange for equity, looking at whether the homeowner would remain in the home or not. The situation is certainly a complicated one. What is clear is that it is one of great urgency and one that continues to affect more and more homeowners on a daily basis.
I'm joined now by economics lecturer Seamus Coffey, Aideen Hayden from Threshold and journalist Eamon Delaney. Good evening. Seamus, can I come to you first? 1 in 10